Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of completely unnecessary historical insight, the kind of knowledge that won't get you a promotion but might make you the most interesting person at 3 a.m. in a Waffle House. Tonight, or whatever time your body thinks it is, we're diving fork first into medieval food. Not ye old Instagram charcuterie board, medieval, but the real stuff. The kind that wobbled, buzzed, and probably had a name before you ate it. This is why you'd regret eating in the Middle Ages. And trust me, you would. Not just because the chicken was raw or the bread tried to kill you, but because the entire act of feeding yourself in the medieval world was basically one long culinary deathmatch against nature, bacteria, and social class. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. On the road, in bed, or hiding from co-workers in a supply closet. I love seeing where this strange little sleep horror history journey finds people. All right, let's eat, or more accurately, let's survive. So, let's start with the basics. You're hungry. It's the 13th century, and you, poor soul, live in a time before refrigerators, preservatives, food safety laws, or even the common sense to not store fish next to manure. Dinner is no longer a craving, it's a threat. Let's say someone offers you meat. Fancy, right? A roast, perhaps? Well, don't get excited. Aged beef in the modern world is a luxury. In medieval Europe, aged just meant forgotten behind a cart for 3 weeks while flies threw a rave on it. The smell? Imagine a mix between wet leather, armpit, and broken promises. The texture? Somewhere between jerky and regret. And before you ask, yes, people ate it anyway. Why? Because starving was worse, usually. And this is where spices come in. You know, those exotic medieval spice roots we all learned about. You may have thought they were about flavour. They weren't. They were about masking rot. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, all those fragrant little luxuries that now live in your cinnamon lattes were, back then, desperately sprinkled over meat to trick your nose into thinking it wasn't actively trying to kill you. And here's the punchline. If you had those spices, you were rich, nobility level rich. Which means, ironically, that the wealthiest people in the land were basically eating glorified corpse meat. Just, with flair. Meanwhile, peasants, the other 95% of the population, weren't dining on mouldy venison. No, they had something even worse. Black bread. Which sounds metal, but really wasn't. This bread was made from whatever grains hadn't already been eaten by rats or claimed by mildew. Barley, rye, chaff, sometimes sawdust, I'm not even kidding, mashed together into a sort of dense brick-like loaf that could double as a weapon in a pinch. And occasionally, for that surprise medieval twist, it came with a dose of ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and when consumed can cause hallucinations, seizures, and what medieval people charmingly called dancing mania. Picture Woodstock, but everyone's on fire and screaming in Latin. So, yeah. If you've ever hallucinated after eating toast, you may want to call a doctor, but in the 1300s, it just meant you were part of God's mysterious plan. Now you may be thinking, well, hey, surely they could just eat seasonally, right? Like a cozy farmer's market situation, all root vegetables and cabbagey optimism? Yeah, about that. Seasonal eating in the Middle Ages wasn't a Pinterest aesthetic. It was a polite way of saying you eat what's left or you don't eat at all. That meant, come winter, if you ran out of salted pork or pickled something or other, your meal plan just became air and anxiety. Food preservation was a joke. Salted meats were stored in cellars that fluctuated between too damp and actively haunted. Dried goods were fair game for insects, rats, and your neighbour's sketchy cousin who stole turnips. And smoking meat required, wait for it, wood, which many peasants couldn't afford to burn because they needed it not to freeze to death. And speaking of salted pork, fun fact, If it wasn't cured properly, it could give you trichinosis, which is just a fancy way of saying internal parasite with a bad attitude. It's like a house guest you never invited, and it lives in your intestines. Oh, and don't get any ideas about sneaking a better meal on the sly. That's where sumptuary laws come in. These were actual legal codes that regulated what you were allowed to wear, buy, or eat based on your social rank. Basically, it was illegal for a peasant to indulge in anything too delicious, because apparently enjoying a mildly spiced stew could cause class riots. You think I'm exaggerating? In England, there were actual laws saying commoners couldn't eat flesh meat more than twice a week. As if the biggest threat to the throne was Dave the pig farmer, whipping up a nice lamb curry and getting ideas. These laws were all about reinforcing status. Because in medieval logic, if you started eating like a noble, you might start thinking like one. And God forbid the bakery apprentice figures out he deserves not to die of cabbage-based scurvy before age 27. By the way, the noble diet wasn't exactly safer, just more gilded. They had more access to meat and spices, sure, but they also had servants who pre-tasted food in case it was poisoned, which, honestly, says a lot. And if you were part of the landed gentry, your feast might include an entire roasted swan, feathers and all, stuffed with smaller birds like some kind of poultry matryoshka doll, all served on trenchers, which were basically old pieces of bread used as edible plates. And yes, they absorbed everything: grease, sauce, meat juice, and then got handed off to the poor. Because nothing says charity like used gravy bread. Compare that to now. We have refrigerators, expiration dates, microwaves that don't smell like tragedy. And if something's off, we leave a review. Imagine trying to Yelp a roast boar in 1362. Disappointing. Overcooked and possibly haunted. Waiter was a monk with one eye and a limp. Would not recommend. Anyway, before we move on, if you're starting to feel grateful for your expired gas station sandwich or cold slice of pizza, good. You should be. Medieval food wasn't rustic or charming. It was desperate survival wrapped in mouldy dough and wishful thinking. And if you think the ingredients were bad, wait until we get into the kitchens themselves. So stay where you are, keep driving, or nodding off, or pretending to work. Because next, we're stepping into the smoky, chaotic, and vaguely cursed world of medieval cooking, where the fire was real, the hygiene was theoretical, and the stew never, ever ended. You're gonna love it, or at least mildly resent it in a cozy, sleepy sort of way. Let's say, hypothetically, you've managed to survive the medieval market. You bought some meat that only smells mildly like a corpse, and you didn't hallucinate too hard after eating that ergot bread. Congrats. Now you get to cook it. And this is where things really spiral into the realm of culinary horror. Because cooking, in the Middle Ages, was less about elevating ingredients and more about not starting a fire that eats your house, or your neighbour's house, or your livestock. Kitchens weren't just dangerous. They were aggressively unhinged. First of all, there were no chimneys, like none. That smoky, wood-fired aesthetic we all romanticize now. Yeah, back then, it just meant every kitchen was basically a low-budget sauna with carbon monoxide as the main seasoning. Most cooking was done over an open hearth, a fire pit in the middle of the room with no ventilation, surrounded by flammable things, blind optimism, and a general disregard for breathing as a long-term goal. Cooks, and I use that term loosely, would spend hours in these smoke caves, blinking through soot, crying actual tears of pain, and slowly going blind in one eye. Not metaphorically. Real life, irreversible medieval one-eye blindness was basically a workplace hazard. OSHA was not returning their scrolls. And the equipment? Look, if you've ever complained about your non-stick pan warping in the dishwasher, just know that medieval pots were often made of iron so rough you could use them to exfoliate a horse. The pans had no lining, the ladles were made of wood that probably still had bark on them, and the knives looked like someone tried to whittle a sword during an anxiety attack. Now let's talk about the food itself. You ever heard of pottage? No? That's because it doesn't exist anymore, for good reason. It was a never-ending stew, like literally never-ending. You made a pot of mushy slop and just kept adding to it, day after day, bits of turnip here, half a rabbit there, some old barley you found in a sack that smelled like goat. No one knew what was in it, not even the person cooking it. Honestly, there's a non-zero chance some of those pots develop sentience. It was the edible version of a college group project, chaotic, inconsistent, and somehow always slightly damp. And don't go thinking meat was treated any better. If it wasn't boiled into a greyish pulp that looked like it had already been digested once, it was roasted until the outside was carbonized and the inside still mooed. Food safety wasn't a concept yet. If you didn't die from undercooked pork, congratulations, your stomach acid just beat trichinosis in a fist fight. Vegetables? Oh, they were cooked for hours, soft, colourless, sad, like they had seen things. Honestly, calling it a vegetable at that point feels generous. It was more of a plant-based memory. And utensils? No forks. Forks were still considered excessively French, which in medieval England was basically an insult that could get you excommunicated. Most people just used a knife and their hands, or someone else's hands if they were close enough. Food was often served in communal bowls, and you shared, not just with your family, but with whoever was around. Remember, hand washing wasn't a thing, and you're all double dipping into the same bowl of lukewarm pottage with fingers that were just recently involved in farming, butchering, or worse. Still hungry? Let's move to the noble kitchens, where things get even weirder. Because if peasants were just trying not to die, nobles were actively trying to impress God, each other, and probably their pet hawks. Noble feasts were events, and by events I mean fever dreams, catered by someone who had read exactly one cookbook and thought, not cursed enough. They made meat dishes shaped like castles, or dragons, or entire forests. There were pies filled with other pies. There were sausages shaped into knots and birds reassembled with their own feathers, like some culinary taxidermy nightmare. And yes, they sometimes served peacocks, redressed in their full, flamboyant feather displays. Because nothing says wealth and taste like eating a bird that looks like it's judging you for your life choices. Oh, and half of these dishes were served cold. Not because it was a vibe, but because cooking took hours and medieval banquet halls were the size of small fortresses. So by the time the sculpted meat dolphin on a sea of mashed peas arrived at your table, it was room temperature, vaguely greasy, and probably still raw in the middle. Presentation mattered more than edibility. If it looked impressive, that was enough. Eating it was optional, surviving it was extra credit. Also, keep in mind, many of these lavish creations weren't made in some spotless kitchen. They were made in the same smoke-choked firebox as everything else, usually by a cook who had never read a recipe and probably couldn't read at all. Cooking instructions were oral, inconsistent, and heavily influenced by superstition, astrology, and the personal opinions of whichever monk had wandered in that day. And let's not forget dessert, because they sort of did. Dessert in the Middle Ages wasn't a charming little finale. It was more like, here, have some spiced jelly made of boiled animal bones and honey, or candied fennel seeds, or something called marchpane, which was like marzipan, if marzipan was harder, weirder, and suspiciously dusty. If they were feeling fancy, nobles might end a meal with a subtlety, which was anything but subtle. These were edible sculptures that looked like animals, castles, ships, or moral allegories, made of sugar paste and frustration. Imagine biting into what you thought was a roast goose, only to find it's actually sugar moulded into the shape of a roast goose, sitting atop an actual roast goose, like some medieval nesting doll of disappointment. Meanwhile, peasants were still eating stew out of a wooden bowl with a spoon they had to share with the goat. And if you're wondering about hygiene, please don't. The floors were dirt. The food was placed on trenchers, basically stale bread used as plates. Once it soaked up all the grease and meat juices, it was either eaten, given to the poor, or, best case, fed to the dogs. That is, if the dogs didn't just eat it off the table first. And yes, there were always dogs under the table. Because medieval dining was, in essence, a very sweaty picnic with more rules and fewer napkins. Honestly, Gordon Ramsay wouldn't survive 10 minutes in a medieval kitchen. He'd be screaming about raw chicken while the cook tried to explain that the oven is actually just the corner of the fire that looks slightly less like death. Still with me? Good, because things only get worse from here. You've acquired the food. You've cooked the food. Barely. Now comes the real fun. Eating it and living with the consequences. Because once that mystery meat casserole enters your body, you've officially enrolled in the medieval gastrointestinal Olympics. And spoiler alert, no one wins. Especially your intestines. Ready? Let's talk about digestion. And, death. You dodged the suspicious pork pie that looked like it had seen some things. You powered through the communal sludge bowl of pottage with only one visible hair floating in it. You even managed to gnaw your way through that crust of barley bread, so dense it could double as a murder weapon. Congrats. Now begins the second half of your medieval dining experience, the part where your body decides whether to digest your food or punish you for your hubris. Now, people back then didn't exactly know how digestion worked, but that didn't stop them from having opinions. Loud, confident, medically confusing opinions. You see, everything was based on humoral theory, which is kind of like astrology for your spleen. The idea was that your body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And if those weren't in balance, well, tough luck. You were about to cry blood, smell weird, and probably die. A pear? That was too cold and wet. Might give you melancholia. Fish? Also cold and wet. Congratulations. Now you're full of phlegm and morally weak. Want to fix that? Eat red meat and drink wine, obviously. Red meat was hot and dry, so it balanced out your cold, wet sadness, like a medieval steakhouse therapy session. And wine wasn't just encouraged, it was medicine. Imagine your doctor prescribing a nice Merlot and a nap because your bile was having an off day. Honestly, not the worst medical advice I've heard. But digestion wasn't left entirely to chance. People helped it along, enthusiastically. Some medieval health regimens involve vomiting on purpose. Yes, just casually reversing your meal as a lifestyle choice. Think of it as the proto-goop cleanse, but with more bile and less branding. If that didn't work, you could always try bloodletting, which was basically the medieval version of hitting the reset button, except the button is a vein in your arm, and the consequences are blood loss. Still feeling off? Time for an enema. Nothing says self-care like irrigating your innards with a hollowed-out goose quill and herbal sludge. There were even dedicated clyster syringes for the job. Picture a medieval nurse with strong forearms, bad aim, and 0 boundaries. And if you think that's the end of it, oh buttercup, no. Let's talk about food poisoning. Today, it's a rare hiccup. Maybe a dodgy taco. You spend a regrettable night in the bathroom, text your friend never again, and move on. But in the Middle Ages, food poisoning could be your final chapter. Meat often sat out for days, or weeks, just vibing in the pantry with flies, bacteria, and the occasional small rodent. There were no sell-by dates, just a vague sniff test and some hopeful seasoning. If you undercooked your pork, you didn't just risk salmonella. You got a fun little souvenir called trichinosis, where tiny parasitic worms burrow into your muscles like they're signing a lease. And then there were the tapeworms. Oh yes. Those uninvited freeloaders who took eating for two to a horrifying new level. Tapeworms could grow up to 30 feet long. That's, well, roughly a standard school bus if the bus was translucent and lived in your intestines rent-free. Now, let's zoom in on the medieval tooth situation, which is not for the faint of heart. People back then weren't exactly flossing, or brushing, or rinsing with anything that didn't come from a stagnant well. A typical medieval mouth looked less like a smile and more like an archaeological dig site. You'd eat stew with chunks of bone in it, because who needs dental x-rays when you can just guess? One bad bite and crack, there goes another tooth now rattling around in your mush like a sad little surprise prize. If you had a rotten molar, there were two options: suffer in pain or go see the barber surgeon, who doubled as your dentist, surgeon, and probably your town's most terrifying man. He'd yank it out with a pair of pliers, zero anesthesia, and the bedside manner of a blacksmith trying to fix a carriage wheel. And look, we haven't even covered what happened when all this left your body. Because medieval digestion wasn't just about eating, it was about surviving the exit strategy. Think cramped latrines, communal outhouses, and buckets of shame tossed into the street at 7 a.m. sharp. Sanitation was a loose concept, like very loose. Diarrhea was common, like really common. And if you got dysentery, congratulations, you are now a walking cautionary tale with a 50-50 survival rate. That medieval meat pie just rolled its final dice. But still, they kept eating. Because what else were they going to do? Starve? Actually, yes, frequently, but we'll get to that. For now, the only thing more mysterious than how food went in was how it ever managed to come out without setting off a town-wide panic. So, let's recap. You eat something grey and meat-adjacent. You pray it doesn't contain any extra protein in the form of worms. Your body, confused and alarmed, tries to balance its humours like an anxious waiter carrying 4 soup bowls on a unicycle. You purge or vomit or get bled with leeches. You chip a tooth on gristle. And then, if the gods are smiling, you digest it and live to be mocked by your local monk for your sin of gluttony. And remember, this was normal. This was daily life. This wasn't some back-alley horror show, it was Wednesday. Honestly, it's a miracle anyone had the strength to invent anything between bathroom sprints. But the cherry on top, the very peak of absurdity, is how eating was somehow also a performance, a ritual, a social power move. There were rules, so many rules. Not about cooking safely, of course. No, that would be too logical. The rules were about how to sit, how to chew, when to talk, and who got the fancy seat near the salt. Because obviously, nothing says dignified nobility like balancing a greasy duck leg in one hand while performing etiquette yoga with the other. We'll get into that bizarre dinner theatre next, where nobles strutted through 6-course banquets like they were auditioning for a Renaissance cooking show, judged entirely on posture and passive aggression. But for now, let your stomach settle. You made it through the most hazardous part of medieval dining, the part where the food tries to kill you from the inside out. And hey, maybe double-check your fridge in the morning. That leftover chicken? Probably safer than anything on the menu in 1347. But, don't push it. So here's a question no one has ever asked unironically. What if dinner was a high-stakes social exam with a side of peacock and crippling anxiety? Welcome to the noble table, where the food might kill you, but the etiquette will ruin you first. Because in medieval aristocratic dining, it wasn't about eating. Oh no, it was about performing hunger, quietly, gracefully, and preferably without getting grease on your silk sleeves or making eye contact with the salt. Yes, the salt. That crusty little pile of mineral became a seating chart. If you were placed above the salt, congrats, you mattered. If you were below the salt, you were basically wallpaper with a pulse. You couldn't just sit down and eat either. Meals started with a literal hand-washing ceremony, performed for you by someone lower in the food chain, both socially and probably nutritionally. A servant would come around with a bowl of lukewarm water, and you delicately rinse your noble fingers like you'd just lightly committed a murder and didn't want to ruin your rings. And let's talk about those rings, because cutlery wasn't a thing nobles took seriously. Forks were suspiciously foreign, French even, and thus heretical. So the upper class insisted on eating meat with their fingers very deliberately to show off their absurd, bejeweled hand furniture. It wasn't unhygienic if your pinky ring was worth a cow. Meanwhile, peasants were somewhere outside trying to gnaw nutrition out of a boiled turnip that had been stepped on. And inside the hall, oh, the pageantry. Food was paraded in like it was about to perform Hamlet. Trumpets, processions, possibly a guy in tights reciting poetry to a roast swan. And let's not forget the dishes themselves, which were less nourishment and more edible hallucination, like a pie filled with live birds. That's not a joke, that's a documented thing. A server would cut into the crust and, surprise, flap. Out burst confused, underfed birds into the rafters like a budget horror movie. And you were expected to pretend this was fine, that this wasn't, in fact, deeply alarming. Then there were subtleties. No, not nuance. Subtleties were elaborate food sculptures designed to look like something else. Meat disguised as fruit, sugar shaped like castles. One noble ordered a roast boar with glowing eyes and a flaming snout, because apparently he wanted his dinner to double as a safety hazard. And yes, these were served cold, because food safety wasn't a real concept. But dramatic flair? Absolutely mandatory. Now, the rulebook for noble dining was extensive. And by rulebook, I mean there were literal manuals on how not to be a disgusting embarrassment in front of the Duke. You had to know when to sit, when to stand, when to toast, and above all, when not to eat. Like, say, before your social superior did. Jump the gun and you might just uninvite yourself from future life. Also, don't blow your nose in the tablecloth. That was a rule. Not because it was rude, but because someone else might need that tablecloth later. Think about that next time you wipe your mouth with a napkin at Olive Garden. And if you were a woman, well, hopefully you weren't at the table at all. In many noble households, women, especially the ones not directly tied to land or a lineage, were encouraged to dine separately or not at all. Dogs, however, were allowed under the table, sometimes even at the table. So, hierarchy went. Lord, fancy dog, maybe wife, probably not you. Now, if you committed a social faux pas, let's say you reached across someone for a hunk of meat without the proper apology bow technique, you wouldn't be physically punished. You'd just be remembered as that guy, the one who cut his cheese with the wrong end of the knife. Medieval memory was long and judgmental. Also worth noting, the bread on the table wasn't necessarily for eating. It was called a trencher, and it acted as your personal plate. You'd scoop food onto it, let the juices soak in, and if you were feeling generous, give the soggy, meat-flavoured bread to the poor afterward. Because who wouldn't be grateful for a pre-licked carb sponge? And entertainment didn't end with surprise birds or questionable hygiene. Sometimes jesters were hired to mock guests mid-meal. Imagine trying to politely dissect a peacock thigh with three nobles side-eyeing you while a court jester yells, "Nice grip, my lord. You handle that drumstick like a wounded squirrel." Even music had rules. You couldn't just have ambience. Harpists and flautists had to play before and after the meal, not during. You needed to chew in contemplative silence, as if that helped digestion, as if anything helped digestion. And remember, all of this, every slice of boiled swan and bread bowl napkin and harp interlude, was taking place in a room lit by torches, warmed by an open fire, filled with the smell of game meat, wool, and whatever Count Roger had stepped in outside. Meanwhile, down in the village, a farmer was squatting in the dirt, trying to remember what dinner felt like, while the nobles were out here sculpting chickens into dragons and calling it a Tuesday. So, yeah. Was noble dining more hygienic? Absolutely not. More dignified? That's a strong maybe, but it was theatrical, and the stakes were real. Not just the meat on a stick kind, but the social kind. The kind where one misstep could cost you favour, land, or just a seat at the next bird explosion banquet. And it's about to get worse, because while nobles were stuffing themselves with undercooked swan and performing macaroni opera with their hands, the rest of the country was beginning to run out of food. Not just bad food, not just weird food, no food. Sweet dreams. Let's talk famine. Because you've slogged through spoiled meat, smoke-choked kitchens, gastrointestinal trauma, and dinner parties where the only thing more dangerous than the undercooked swan was the social etiquette. And now, finally, we reach the last course. Starvation, bon appetit. See, if medieval dining was a game of Russian roulette with a spoon, then famine was the part where they threw the whole spoon away and handed you a rock. And not even a clean one. I'm talking about a rock someone else already licked. Twice. Because yes, dear listener, while the nobles were stuffing peacocks with smaller, more confused peacocks and sculpting butter into castles for fun, the rest of the population was out here chewing on bark and praying for mushrooms that wouldn't kill them immediately. Let's talk about the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. A charming little event where it rained so much crops drowned, livestock died, and entire villages more or less gave up and moved directly into despair. Food prices skyrocketed, trade collapsed, and people, well, they started getting creative. Not Pinterest creative, more like, can I boil this leather shoe creative. And yes, people did that. They boiled shoes. They made soup out of grass, moss, roots, bark if they were lucky. They ground acorns into flour, which sounds rustic and cute, until you realise acorns contain tannins that, if not properly leached out, will turn your intestines into a slip and slide of regret. But they didn't have much choice, because even when you did have access to food, preservation methods were, let's call them hope-based. Salt was precious, drying meat only worked if you had sun and time, and smoke curing required, oh right, a functioning fire and some form of shelter. So most of the time, you were left with mystery meat jerky that smelled like wet socks and tasted like the bottom of a plague doctor's mask. Storage too was its own tragedy. Imagine storing your hard-earned grain in a wooden bin, only to open it months later and find it teeming with beetles, mould, and something that might have once been a rat but now looks more like a haunted raisin. You didn't throw it out, you just picked around the extra protein and hoped your children weren't picky eaters. And it wasn't just one big famine and done. No. Starvation was a seasonal experience, like pumpkin spice, but more screaming. Spring, ironically, was the most dangerous time. Why? Because by then your winter stores were running out and the new crops weren't ready yet. It was known as the lean season, and not in a trendy, intermittent fasting way. More in a, maybe I'll gnaw on my belt today kind of way. Oh, and just for extra flavour, let's talk about how the church waltzed in with their fasting laws. Lent, Advent, Ember Days. They told people when they were not allowed to eat certain things, as if anyone had the luxury of turning down meat when all they'd seen for 2 weeks was boiled hay stew. Now, to be fair, fasting was supposed to be about spiritual discipline, but in practice, it was also a sneaky way to manage food scarcity. We're out of cheese, Brother Thomas, must be God's will. Sure, okay. And the consequences of famine went beyond hunger. Starved bodies are weak bodies. Disease loves a malnourished host, Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, even cannibalism rumours cropped up during the worst famines. Were they true? Probably not often. But the fact that they could have been says enough. I mean, if someone in your village disappeared during a particularly bad winter and you suddenly saw your neighbour roasting something suspiciously meaty over a fire, you might not ask too many questions. Even bread, our old medieval friend, turned on people. In desperate times, they'd bulk it out with anything: straw, sawdust, or weird weeds pulled from the roadside. Some of those additions were toxic, others were just emotionally damaging. There's a reason ergot, the lovely hallucinogenic fungus we mentioned earlier, kept turning up in bread supplies. It thrived on damp rye, which was everywhere, and so you'd have villagers hallucinating snakes, convulsing in the fields or dancing naked through town square during what was definitely not a harvest festival. If your bread made you see the devil, you weren't going to finish dinner. By now you might be asking, well, what about food aid? What about nobles helping the poor? Oh, you sweet, naive crust of a human. Food aid was spotty at best, maliciously mismanaged at worst. Local lords might hand out grain, but often in exchange for fealty, labour, or your last goat. And monasteries did sometimes feed the poor, assuming you were the right kind of poor, came on the right day, and didn't mind hearing 3 hours of sermons before the soup arrived, which, by the way, usually contained something between cabbage water and despair. It wasn't all doom, though. Communities were weirdly resilient. People shared more than you'd expect. Entire villages learned to rotate meals, ration supplies, or collectively hunt rats, which, yes, sometimes made it to the dinner table. Protein is protein, even if it squeaks. Eventually, there'd be a decent harvest. People would recover. Fields would bloom again. Babies would stop looking like little famine goblins and start looking like slightly healthier goblins. Life went on. But that constant looming dread of empty granaries and empty bellies never really left. That's the part we forget now. That food, this thing we complain about for being too cold, too bland, or not delivered fast enough, used to be a daily life or death gamble. Your dinner could kill you, or save you, or turn you into a raving mess with a tapeworm the size of a jump rope. So the next time you burn a frozen pizza, just remember, at least it's your frozen pizza, not something you traded your child's winter shoes for, not rat stew, not bark paste shaped into Little Hope biscuits. Just a pizza that you can throw out because you have other food. God, we're spoiled. All right, I'm done scaring you out of your midnight snack. Sweet dreams, fellow insomniac, or safe drive if you're out haunting the highways in search of better decisions. Either way, smash that subscribe button like it owes you grain and leave a comment about the worst thing you've ever eaten. I need the validation.